Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Black Literature's 2020 official Brooklyn Book Festival bookend event, a literary salon with writer and scholar Imani Perry. My name is Clarence Reynolds. I'm director of the Center for Black Literature. And on behalf of the Center and the Brooklyn Book Festival, I'm delighted to have you join us for tonight's event. Since 2002, the Center for Black Literature their mission has been to broaden and enrich the public's knowledge and aesthetic appreciation of literature produced by people of the African diaspora. Through our programs, such as the National Black Writers Conference and the John Oliver Killens Reading Series, which this is a part of, we have presented an array of programs, wonderful literary programs that feature some of the most engaging, exhilarating, and influential writers and poets. This evening, we are honored to have with us Dr. Imani Perry. Dr. Perry is the author of several books, including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, an intimate portrait of the brilliant artist, playwright, and activist who happens to be one of my personal sheroes. Joining Dr. Perry this evening, she will be in conversation with Dr. Brenda Greene. Dr. Greene is professor of English, founder and executive director at the Center for Black Literature, and director of the National Black Writers Conference at Medgar Evers College at the University of New York. Professor Greene's research and scholarly work include composition, African American literature, and multicultural literature. She is editor of The African Presence and Influence on the Cultures of the Americas, and co-editor of Resistance and Transformation, Conversations with Black Writers, and Meditations and Ascensions, Black Writers on Writing. As a scholar and literary activist, Dr. Greene has led several writing seminars, and she's been acknowledged for her professional work and by many educational, advocacy, and educational organizations and institutions. She has extensive work in essays, grants, book reviews, and presentations in English studies and literature. She is also the host of the weekly radio program Writers on Writing, which airs on Sundays at 7 p.m. over WNYE 91.5 FM. We're in for a very engaging conversation with Dr. Greene and Dr. Perry. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenda Greene.
And also offer a special thank you to our students, our faculty, and the friends of the Center for Black Literature family. And very, very pleased to have Dr. Imani Perry with us, a phenomenal woman. Dr. Imani Perry is an American interdisciplinary scholar of race, lore, literature, and African American culture. She is currently the Hughes-Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and her affiliated programs are in lore, public affairs, gender, and sexuality studies. She writes in multiple fields, which include lore, literature, and cultural studies. Having received her Bachelor's of Arts in American Studies and Literature from Yale, she went on to earn a PhD in American Civilization from Harvard University and her JD from Harvard Law School, where she graduated, are you ready? At the age of 27, 2 degrees at the age of 27. She completed a Future Law Professor's Fellowship and received her LLM from the Georgetown University Law Center. Before joining the Princeton faculty, Dr. Perry taught at Rutgers School of Law in Camden, New Jersey for 7 years, where she received the New Professor of the Year award in her first year and was promoted to full professor at the end of 5 years. She also won the Board of Trustees Fellowship for Scholarly Excellence. Dr. Perry has written a number of books. We will be discussing them today. Of course, they include Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, and May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem, published by the University of North Carolina Press, and which won or was a nominee for the 50th NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Fiction. We also are going to hear her discuss a beautiful book, and I'm going to begin with that, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. And Dr. Perry, it is a beautiful letter that you've written to your sons. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to have a chance to talk to you and to see all the folks who are in the chat. It's really wonderful. And thank you for the work that you do. So I've been a long admirer, so it's really wonderful to
Well, you're welcome.
talk. Yeah.
When I read your book, The Letter to Your Sons, it really resonated for me because I also have two sons.
Mm-hmm.
And I know personally what it was like, the fears, the anxieties, the desires you had in raising two Black men in America. And you are still dealing with it because your sons are teenagers.
That's right.
But yes, and your letter is much more than that. It's also the history of race in this country, the history of Black people. And it's also something that can resonate not only with mothers, but with anyone who is raising children, with their aunts, the grandmothers, the godmothers, the fathers. And I would recommend this book for anyone who is dealing with Black men. And Eddie, I just want to share something that your colleague and I know writing friend, writing mentor, colleague who wrote, Eddie Glau, Dr. Eddie Glau wrote about the book. Beautifully written with brilliant insights that leap off the page. Breathe announces the arrival of Imani Perry as a literary force. With each sentence, Perry reveals her mastery of the genre of the essay and her vast knowledge of the tradition of not only to her sons, but for all of us. This is a must read, especially in these dark times. And I totally agree with him. So let's beginning with that. You called the book Breathe, A Letter to My Son. And of course, we think about Eric Gardner. But breathe is a metaphor for much more than that. Would you elaborate on that? What were you thinking about when you decided to write this?
For me, the title is an imperative. That's where I was. The last thing I was saying is that it is sort of seeing our claiming breath and breathing as resistance, so that there's a part of the book that's lament, but it's also about wanting to give our children and really all of us, right? It's a letter to all of us, a sense of possibility, a sense of refusal of the terms, the ways in which we are suffocated, and insistence upon living and life was really important to me because I kept hearing, and it's true. This is in some ways a really terrifying world. But we have to give our young people in particular some sense of possibility, right? And something to draw on. So that was sort of what was behind the title.
Okay. And you describe your sons, interesting names, Freeman Diallo
Yes.
and Issa Gardner. Tell us a little bit about your sons. And so of course, they were the motivation for writing this book. So what do you want to share about the spirit and special qualities of each of your sons?
Oh gosh, I could go on forever. So Freeman is. I'm trying to speak up because I see the question, the comment in the chat. Freeman is an artist, a musician, kind of an intellectual, and is named after an ancestor who chose the name Freeman after escaping from slavery, and that sense of sort of claiming one's freedom, right, is part of why he was named in that way. Issa bears my grandmother's last name as his middle name. Garner is a family name. They were farmers in rural Alabama, landowners immediately after emancipation. And Issa means God is our salvation, or salvation. It also means river in Songhai. He is a writer. He's, really a writer,
Like his mother.
like his mother, and an athlete, and as someone, and I write about this in the book, who is very devoted to friendship and is in some ways a model for me about how to cultivate meaningful friendship. And so I try to, of course, as a parent, you try to guide, but you also try to learn from your children, right? To understand as a dynamic relationship. And so I'm trying to do that with them constantly, and to be open to, you know, the wisdom that they have to share with me and their experiences, which are different, right? I think so often we're so worried, we're telling kids what to do, what to think, and it can be hard to listen, right, and to witness. And so that is an ongoing, I think, lesson for me, that I'm trying to learn as a parent.
Right. Our children are always teaching us
Yeah.
lessons, right? They're
Oh,
always teaching us. But I'm sure in writing this, and you described how you were writing it when you were in Japan.
yes.
How did this affect you as a mother, your development, your growth as a mother, and also your relationship with your children, your sons?
That's interesting. So, in part, I didn't feel like it had a direct impact on my relationship with them, because there's nothing in the book that they hadn't heard me say 100 times. Right? I mean, it really is. It's stylized, of course, because it's a work of art. It's a creative work, but it is. It's a product of conversations. You know, I allowed them the opportunity to take anything out, you know, so anything that they didn't want in the book, I took out of the book. So, and it was sort of like the book is this thing over here, right? And our relationship is a sort of living, breathing thing, right? So it's an artifact because I was writing when they were much younger, so they're in a different place, right? Also, but it definitely did have an impact on my conception of myself as a mother, because I think parenting is creative. Parenting is also an art. There's a lot of pressure to treat it like a science, right? So that, you know, these are the things that you have to do. This is the structure. And in the writing, it made me reflect on how much it is an art, right? And it's something that you try to craft, and it's an ongoing relationship. It allowed me a kind of gentleness with myself. It allowed me to remember all the lessons that have been poured into me, to appreciate my elders in some new ways, you know, and to invoke them in some new ways as a parent. So it was a very meaningful experience for me as a mother. Yeah. So I'll leave them to decide if it matters.
So just following up on that, as I said, you're telling their story, but you're also are reflecting on social movements and police brutality. You divide the book into three parts: fear, fly, and fortune. Can you reflect on that? What you were thinking about?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. So so it tracks the sections. So there's a lot of earlier works of Black literature that directly shape this. The sections track the sections of Richard Wright's Native Son, right? For fear, flight, and fate. And I wanted to switch flight to fly because I wanted it not to be focused on fugitivity, but what does it mean to actually invest in our children so they might fly, right?
Yes.
To be willing to let them fly, right? And fortune, I wanted to think instead of in terms of the sort of foregone fate, to think about the abundance of the tradition they had to draw from, our tradition and its beauty. So there's references, there's ways in which I was influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, influenced by both Beloved and Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, of course by Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And also Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which has the same sections as Wright's Native Son. But there's also something very particular about, for me and my identity as a mother to sons, that is different for sort of whether it's uncle to nephew or father to sons. And a lot of that is about also wanting to encourage them to be able to access the tenderness, the vulnerability, um, so to say you have a lot to draw on, but you also, can come into the fold when you need to and be nurtured and rest.
Right.
That's sort of the balance I was trying to strike.
Right. That's the history. We have that history, as you said, in our literature. And as I was reading it, I even thought of, more recently when Maya Angelou talked about "And Still I Rise,"
Oh,
or
yes.
if you look at, you look at what Ta-Nehisi Coates did and what Colson Whitehead did in giving people magical powers, these, bringing in the speculative fiction, the magical realism. And I think that's part of our culture. That's part of the literature,
Yes.
and that's part of even Virginia Hamilton, "The People Could Fly," right? That's very much a part of who we are, and that's why when I saw the "Fear, Flight, and Fortune," that's what came to mind.
Oh, yeah. No,
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about "The People Could Fly" and Ebo Landing and Sun Ra also, who
Yes.
is from
Yes.
the same neighborhood in Birmingham, and the way that he could imagine himself, being from outer space in what was considered the most racist city in the country, right?
Right.
That imagination, yeah, that wanting them to be able to tap into that.
Right. That music metaphor is in all of your books. It's
Yes.
very clear that music is everywhere in each of your books. So, but there was a warning. I remember at one point you said, "I'm losing my ability to dream a world."
Yeah.
And I thought about what we are going through now with all the racial unrest, the COVID-19, the despair, the depression that so many people are going through, but we need to have ways of survive and to dream a world. So
Yeah.
what were you thinking about when you said that?
I was trying to be honest, and the way in which I was trying to be honest is, I think often, we pour our hopes into our children when we feel vulnerable or unsure. And I've been very mindful of not wanting to overburden my children with my own hopes or anxieties, right? And so I was trying to be honest. I am fearful. I am worried. There's moments where I don't know. As someone who has a lot of political convictions, sometimes I feel like I don't know which way we ought to turn. Um, and there's a humility in that for me, because it's a posture of saying to them as young people, I want to hear from you, what, how you're imagining your vision of a world. I understand that we have to listen to them. They have the greatest imaginations as young people, right? That's the gift of youth, right? So we have history to teach them, the tradition to teach them. They have the most active imaginations. And so I was thinking, I don't know. At moments I just feel like I don't know, but I'm listening.
Okay. So we're going to move to a book that was very, very educational and informative to me. "May We Forever Stand: A History of the Black National Anthem." And as I said, it was a nominee for the 50th NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. I never thought about the Black National Anthem in this way. So what motivated you to write this book? So comprehensive, so much research.
Thank you. You know, I I've always, I think it was a combination of forces. One is that I wanted to find a way to talk about Black institutional life and culture and traditions. And I think one of the things that we have in recent years in Black studies failed to do is to talk about how our institutions sustained us, not just the institutions that were doing advocacy or protest, but the institutions within our communities. And the song became this vehicle because people sang it in this ritual fashion, right? The song was a window for me. It was a way to talk about Black life I think has been neglected. There's lots of wonderful work that's happened in Black studies, but that's a piece that I thought had been neglected. I wanted to talk about, life behind the veil, as Du Bois would say, life in the context of Jim Crow, what it meant to sing the song that told Black life in epic terms, right? And taught Black children a set of politics, a set of values in a society that said that they had no history, right, and no value, right? That is a mode of resistance. And I also thought it was important to talk about what it meant to train and socialize and nurture young people who would come to be those who change the world, right? And so that was what was behind it. It had a lot of naysayers and people who didn't think I'd be able to fill a book.
Yeah, I can't hear you. It's a little
I'm
bit
sorry.
louder.
Okay. Is that better? Is that any better? Can you hear me now?
A little.
Okay. I'll just try to keep speaking up.
Okay.
My goal was to find a way to tell the story that is not immediately available through the traditional academic research modes. So there were lots of people who thought, oh, there won't be enough documents. But if you knew that people sang it in Black clubs and schools and organizations, well, then I could actually find the documents, right? It wasn't going to be, the research wasn't in the paper of the papers of the composer or the papers of the lyricist, James Weldon Johnson. The story was in Black institutions, right? So HBCUs, Black newspapers, Black school records, all of those things. So, that's what I had, and I had thousands of documents.
Right. Right. So I am getting, if you can just try and speak a little bit louder because your voice is fading. I just want to follow up with the idea of the Black National Anthem. I didn't hear that Black National Anthem until I began teaching in the public schools. I grew up in New York City. I went through the entire school system. I ended up teaching in Bedford-Stuyvesant in a public school, a junior high school, and that's when we began to sing the Black National Anthem. And you point that out. I think you heard your son first sing it, and there was a difference in those who had gone to school in the South versus those who went to school in the North.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. This book is really important to think about the rituals, and you talk about why we need to sustain this. But what guided the lyrics around the Black National Anthem? What were James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond Johnson thinking about when they wrote it?
They were one of the things that happened at the turn to the 20th century was this, once the larger society decided they were no longer going to support Reconstruction, the protection of Black citizenship, right? Black people in the South experienced, the establishment of Jim Crow. It was a terrible moment, and yet there's this massive development of Black institutions and Black institutions. So people are not limited in their political imagination, their social imagination by Jim Crow. And so what I was trying to demonstrate as a piece of that is the way in which people built an institutional, a cultural, and associational life for themselves, notwithstanding Jim Crow. And it actually, in many ways, was, I think, the foundation for what happened in the context of Black Power. So essentially, it was sort of trying to push against some of the conventional narratives. And also tell us a history of Black Southern life that hadn't been told, which was really important to me as well. And I'm currently writing about the South more specifically, but that's a part of what I feel is my calling as a writer.
Okay. we meet many people in the pages of this book.
Mm.
We meet people like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Claude McKay, Carter G. Woodson. We meet Gerald Ray Charles, Max Roach. You
Yes.
also talk about many of the movements, the women's clubs, the McCarthyism, the March on Washington, the Black Power movement. How are all of these, how are those people, or if you can just comment on some of the people and some of the movements that really impacted the way that the Black National Anthem evolved?
Right. So one of the things that was really important, and I learned early on in my research, how central Black women were to the dissemination of the song. Right. So the Black Women's Club movement, for example, organizations began printing and distributing the song soon after the Johnson brothers wrote it. So they wrote it while they were living, they were educators in Jacksonville, Florida. They move up to New York and sort of forget about it. The song begins to circulate amongst young people in Jacksonville. And then these women, some of them teachers, community leaders, say, well, no, this functions like an anthem for us. We have to share this song in a formal fashion, right? And that's how it really gets distributed. And one of the things that I found really powerful is that even Black organizations that disagreed on the best political strategy,
Yes.
whether it's, Garveyites here and NAACP here and, Black communists here, all use the song. And I thought, one, it's a testament to how beautiful the song is, right? And how powerful it is. But it's also speaks to a sense of linked fate, right? That there were competing kind of ideological commitments, ideas about how we get to freedom. But there was also some sort of common ground, common terrain. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. It's important to keep in mind in part because one of the things I think we forget is that, with the exception of Haiti, right, at the turn of the century, there's really no place that Black people have full rights of citizenship, not even Liberia, right? The world is colonized, right? And so this sense of how do you build some sense, it's important that the song doesn't say the United States in it, right? That's powerful, right? It's because it's really talking about, even though it's focused, and I tried to see how it traveled around the world beyond Ghana and a little bit in Jamaica. It really is a US based song, but it was really nurtured with the consciousness of sort of a collective Black struggle, and so the song could move politically, it could speak to different organizing efforts, and I think that's that was part of the genius of it and its longevity.
Right. But I remember that was very interesting. There was one point where when there were some Black people who did not want to use that song because they thought that it would mean they were not patriotic enough if they were singing that song.
Yes. And in fact, when I spoke about the book to the national conference of the NAACP, one of the elders said to me, we do not think of this as an anthem. We think of this as the official song of the NAACP, that it was that was an organization that was very clear about saying, we're not declaring it a national anthem. We're just declaring it our official song. There's one national anthem. And then there were people who said, what does that even mean, given how oppressed Black people are, right? There were debates about it. But what I found really powerful is that the leadership didn't dictate that it was an anthem. It was really regular folk, right, who started calling it an anthem, who claimed it as an anthem. And that, so they couldn't really prevent that from happening. And I will say the current national director of the NAACP calls it the Black national anthem, even if the word is,
And just following, you talk about how Chuck D refused to use that song in the film "Do the Right Thing" because again he thought it's too sacred.
Yes, Yes, and it's interesting because we do a lot of improvisation in Black music. It's the song that people tend to stay very close to, except for some jazz musicians experiment with it, right? But by and large, when we sing it a very formal traditional fashion.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I'm so glad you've written that because, as I said, it gives us the history and just reminds us of the importance of knowing that struggle and knowing how that song has been something that has survived through the years. I decided to include it in my course. I
Oh,
hadn't thought about it. I'm teaching a course on the spoken word, but I said I have to include that song
yeah.
because it represents the whole trajectory of our struggle
Mm-hmm.
and now. And so we're going to move to one of my favorite books, Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which also has it won the 2019 Lambda Literary Award, and it won a number of awards, the Pen Bograd-Weld Award for Biography, the Black Caucus of the American Library Association Honor Book for Nonfiction, the Pauline Murray Book Prize in Black Intellectual History as a finalist, and the Judy Grand Triangle Award for Lesbian Nonfiction. I learned so much about Lorraine Hansberry.
Yeah.
I know that, you think about her and you think about young, gifted, and Black. And I just want to share something that Alice Walker wrote about the book. She said, "This is one of those books you need to read. Lorraine Hansberry was so dear, so gifted, so Black, so singular in so many ways that to miss the story of her life is to miss a huge part of ours. She left us way too soon, and yet the gift of her presence, so briefly among us, is still felt in the art she left behind. But not only in the art, but in the life, a life at last made comprehensible by this loving, attentive, thoughtful book." So you have done what you do in everything you write.
Oh,
You really did so much research, and you helped us to become, or at least me, I'll speak for me, to become emotionally connected to Lorraine by giving the story that you did. So why don't we start with why was it so important for you to write this biography of Lorraine
yeah.
Hansberry?
So I mean, partly is she has always been a muse and an inspiration. A Raisin in the Sun is one of those plays that is uh, so perfectly written that it almost you don't realize how extraordinary it is, right? It is the most widely produced play by a Black playwright in the history of the United States, and yet there was very little that was written about her life, even though this play is literally in production somewhere all the time, right? So she had been a muse, and at first, and I also thought she's this person who was at the crossroads of history. She was taught by Du Bois, mentored by Langston Hughes, close friends with Nina Simone, close friends with James Baldwin, worked with the young people in SNCC. So all of these individuals, organizations that had book after book about them, she was connected to, but hadn't been remembered. And so at first I was like, I want to put her in her place as an icon alongside these other icons. And then as I started to do the research, I was like, but no, the story isn't about her being an icon. It's about her being an extraordinary human being, a vulnerable human being, a human being with struggles, a human being who lived with illness. And yet, so that notwithstanding her vulnerability, her challenges, her illness, her all of that, she did something magnificent, and then could function as an inspiration for all of us. So I said, I want to tell her story, actually in a way that feels like it's an invitation, one, for more people to write about her, which I'm really glad about. There's another biography coming out in February by Soyuka Colbert. People should read that one as well. I think there's another coming out in a year or so later. I mean, there's a lot of important work coming down the pike I'm excited about. Um, so it was sort of putting her in historical context, but also allowing her to be a vessel, and she's also all these issues that we're thinking about now, from sexuality to politics to what's, how to socially organize, illness. I mean, all these things that we're talking about, her life can teach us about them, right?
Right. So why don't you follow up with that and highlight some of that? If we go into
Yeah.
the politics,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the social injustice, the movement. She was very much a movement person.
She was a movement person. She was a leftist. She was a socialist. She was an activist. And she was a feminist. And it's important for me to emphasize that, because she was a feminist before the feminist movement, right? She claimed that. And she also, her identification as a lesbian, which, there had been a little bit of writing about, but not really comprehensively, was she connected that to feminism? And that was unusual, actually. Like, there were sort of small, secretive, because this is still a period in time where people could be arrested, bars were
Right.
right? That she was actually trying to think through sexuality, not just in terms of her attraction, but to think about what it meant for women to not be defined by marriage to men, right? To imagine their lives differently. So she was ahead of her time on a range of issues. She was also really militant. She believed in Black self-determination. So she was a leftist, but she also was strongly anti-colonialist. And she believed, for example, in this whole Cold War thing that was happening, the most important thing was for Black nations to define what they wanted to do, not the question of whether they're going to be, aligned with the Soviet Union or the United States, but that they could self-determine, right? And that sort of Black nationalist sensibility aligned with all these other people. I mean, I sort of think she got it all at a period where people were struggling to get one or the other thing, So she's like a beacon, really.
Well, she got it all, but it was kind of ironic the way they responded to
Yeah.
to be young, gifted, and Black.
Yeah.
Not seeing that as progressive enough. You want to
Right.
reflect on how that was received and how she ended up responding to that situation.
Yeah. So there were a lot of, Lorraine grew up bourgeois. Her father was a real estate mogul. Her mother was an educator and also a ward person in Chicago. And there were others on the Black left who would always interpret her work in light of her class position, right?
Right.
And as a consequence, and she had some very strong critics, one of them having been Imani Perry, who said, Raisin is not a bourgeois play. This is just Black middle class people. And actually, the first thing I wrote about Lorraine was about how careful her details were about working class Black life in Chicago. I mean, everything is to a T, right? You could, and so, it was really sort of a mischaracterization. But Baraka, to his credit, later said, I was just wrong. I misread, I overread her, her background. I misread the play. She was very deliberate about making the characters working class, not from her class position. She saw the center of Black struggle with working class Black people. But she also, pushed back when people misinterpreted her. She was an outspoken person. She would, she would tell anybody about themselves. And I love that too. I mean, she even, when Malcolm criticized her for having married a white man, she fussed at him. He apologized. I mean, there's this sort of, she had this remarkable self-possession, as well, alongside her commitment. And but she also thought she was goofy, she was silly, she was self-critical, really quite delightful. Yeah.
Right. I like the way that she responded when she got that criticism. And she said she's a role model for what we have to do. So rather than to try and fight the people who were criticizing the play and who could not see her message, she decided to become a critic. She decided to do her own writing.
Oh, yes.
And I think that is so important. That's such an important lesson
Mm-hmm.
that we have to take responsibility for changing the narrative when the narrative is anti us,
Yes,
know?
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's so important, right, because she didn't internalize the criticism, which is hard to do, right?
Yes.
That's, yeah, it's an essential model. Yeah.
Right. And I also was impressed when she ended up in her activism. W.E.B. Du Bois considered her a political daughter, and
Yes.
she ended up representing Paul Robeson at a major conference after they took his
His passport. Yeah.
passport away.
Mhm.
You know, she and then with the literature, she was speaking to other artists. You mentioned that Gwendolyn Brooks, her friendship with James Baldwin. To
Yes.
Be Young, Gifted, and Black is a tribute to, of course, Langston Hughes.
So,
So she was in conversation with all of these writers.
absolutely. And really, and one of the things that I do wish she got credit for is how much political education she did for someone like Baldwin or for Nina Simone. I mean, she really was a voracious reader. She was a serious intellectual, and she would argue with them and push them on a range of issues. And so, um, you can actually see, and one of the things I tried to write about in the book is you can see that the sort of ongoing conversation between her and James Baldwin, if you look at
Yes.
their writings together, you can see them speaking to each other. You can see her raising issues that he responds to in his work. And I think that's important too, because we tend to think of writing as so solitary, but you really do need community.
You do.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. I always say writers are in conversation with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't aware of how close she was to Nina Simone.
Yeah.
And of course, when we think about Nina Simone and the To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, April Silver pointed out, remember Weldon Irving,
Yeah.
who ended
Oh,
up
yes.
writing this song. But she and Nina Simone were very close.
They were very close,
Yes.
and really, I think supported each other in very difficult moments of their lives, right? And that will actually, there's a book coming out on Nina Simone soon that will explore their friendship further. So there's lots of good
That's
work coming.
exciting. So
Yeah.
you have laid the foundation.
Yeah.
I'm going to move into the Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, which was one of your first books. And you talk about being growing up in hip hop. You say to listen to hip hop is to enter a world of complexity and contradiction.
Yes. Yeah.
So
It is.
elaborate on that. Yes.
It is because it is a deeply American form in the sense that there's a lot of celebration of excess, and there's a lot of bombast and celebration of wealth, and there's hyper masculinity, and there's all these things that are so American, and it's also the sound of resistance, and the sound in particular that comes out of communities that were very deliberately excluded from the American dream, right? And so there's an internal contradiction that is characterized as Black life in many ways. There is a kind of political grappling, like struggle, series of ideas that I think had fallen out of popular music for about 15-20 years before hip hop reemerged, and had a sophistication that I think at this point we take for granted, but I do think is really important to think, what did it mean in the 80s, where the society had turned its back out on the movement, is the Reagan
Right.
era. Everybody, there's deindustrialization, right? People are literally out of work in vast numbers, right? Our cities have been disinvested in. And then you have these young Black folks primarily saying, let's talk about all of this, right?
Right.
And that was truly extraordinary. And for me as a writer, just the constant conversation about writing, about literacy, was important to the pathway to becoming not writing rhymes,
Right.
but yeah.
Right.
So yeah, so it was an intellectual space.
Right. And it's something that I appreciate that you've done that, because of course that has helped and continues to legitimize and validate the lyricists. And
Oh yes.
yes, and you also talk about the special skills that are needed. You want to elaborate on that? The special skills that the
Well,
rapper needs.
it was so important to me, and it in some way, because it feels like another lifetime now, but at that moment, and I think it's important for me to like situate it. When the book came out in 2004, I kind of really finished it in 2002. But at that moment, scholars wrote about hip hop as like, this is what happens when there's no more band in the school. This
Right,
is the
right,
sound of social deprivation. And I was like, there's extraordinary literariness, right? The use of figurative language, the use of extended analogy, the narrative gifts of lyricists, the various positions, the way people personify various characters. MCs were doing literature, and that was not acknowledged. I think there's greater acknowledgement now, but the intellectual work of and time, the sensitivity to time, right, and sound alongside literariness. It was just really important to me to sort of to say something about that
right.
among scholars who I think who now there's tons of scholars who I think get it, but I felt like there were most of the scholars at the time who were writing about it were not as sensitive, and they were generational. There was some phenomenal work, but to sort of to speak what I saw as this extraordinary achievement in my generation.
So when you look at hip hop and what the work of rappers now, what do you see as the differences between when you were writing about that, 15 years ago or 18 years ago actually,
Mm-hmm.
and today and today?
Oh, in terms of the difference in what was going on in music,
Yeah,
or
where do you see what's the state of hip hop now when you look at
yeah,
when you look at the content,
yeah,
the style?
yeah. So it's hard.
It's,
It's hard for me to say because, and I have these ongoing conversations with my children, right?
I'm sure you do.
Um, because now I'm one of the sort of the old fogey who's complaining
You're
about
old school.
right, it's
You're
not as
old school
literary,
now.
it's not, and but I also so I try to enter that with some humility. I also realized that it does now, it is the most popular form of music, so it just doesn't have the same kind of insurgency, right? It's not issuing quite the same kind of challenge. There's a lot of pressure, global pressure, that's oriented towards a global marketplace, so it's not as directly connected to speaking to the concerns and ideas that are coming out of Black urban communities, right? And yet I do think that there are artists who are still masters of lyricism, but also using the voice as an instrument. So some of the folks who
Yes,
are not that they may not be lyricists, but they're like jazz vocalists, right? In the way they're using their voices, they're essentially rebirthing scatting, right?
that's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
so there's so it's still interesting. It's still, I think it's still vital, it's still vibrant. Of course there's you know like anything of the world, right? You could say the same of the church, right? The church as well as the music industry. It has all of the problems of the world in it,
Yes.
right? so
Yeah.
so that's
No,
just
most definitely. Most definitely. And so, more beautiful and more terrible, the embrace and transcendence of racial inequality in the United States. And you took that from James Baldwin's
yes.
a line, "The Fire Next Time." Elaborate on the title and what are the questions that you wanted to ask when you wrote this book?
Yeah. So, you know, I was trying to figure out, this was the question. So most of my scholarship, and I'm going to weave in one of the questions in the chat as an answer, because someone asked, what kind of kinship I felt with Hansberry, as she sort of was trying, the question she was trying to answer with the Raisin in the Sun, is that I think part of how I identify with her is that I start with a question and I try to craft a work that will best allow me to answer the question, right? And so the question was, okay, now we were at a point when I was writing that book, things have changed a little bit, but where people say, everybody's saying racism is bad, nobody wants to be called a racist, it's almost worse than being a racist is being called a racist, all this aversion. And yet there was evidence, not just that racial inequality persisted, but that people sustained it, right? Like, and so people, so I would hear folks saying, talk about institutional racism, legacies of the past, but it actually is an engine that is fed constantly, right? And so I was trying to think how we have to understand why that is in order to begin to address it. And so I just started reading in every field I could imagine. And that is part of why I identify with Lorraine, because she would try to read everything she could imagine. So from neuroscience to media studies and what really emerged for me is this recognition that there's a culture. People are socialized into thinking that Black people deserve less and ought to be treated in inferior fashion. And that's most dramatically. So I looked at all kinds of racialization across the board. And in every arena where I looked, the disadvantaging of people according to race was always most dramatically distributed to Black people. And whether we're talking about the context of immigration or talking about the context of employment, schools, right? So there's a gradation. People are not, it's not just sort of white and non-white. There's a stratification amongst people of color. And so then what I wound up doing is looking to all of the ways those lessons are taught, right? How people are socialized into this notion that Black people deserve to be treated worse, with the idea that helps us think about how to respond. And part of the way we have to respond is to tell different types of stories about people. People are taught that people are taught Black inferiority. People are taught to disadvantage Black folks, right? And so that was, that was the project. There's, in a sense, we've gone backwards from the
Most definitely
book, right?
Yeah,
That book 9 years ago.
Yes.
So that's another thing.
Right. Take critical race theory out of the school. Those people are all leftists, right? We don't need to teach people. We're not teaching. We're teaching people to hate our country. It is really.
Yeah.
We've gone back. It's. I'm reminded of Reconstruction.
Yes.
In terms of how people are responding. I just finished rereading one of Marita Golden's book called "And Do Remember Me." Yes. And there's a line, you know that book?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. There's a line where she says, race is everywhere. A many-headed beast cut off a head, another lashes out, while the previously amputated spontaneity regenerates. So race is, well, maybe that was something you said. She said racism is a virus, and since nobody's really looking too hard for a cure, it reproduces itself over and over again.
Yeah.
And so we still have these questions around race relations, around racism. What do we do? What's the future? What's the message?
Yeah.
That we can, how do we survive this? How do we overcome that? I know those are many questions. And as you think about that, I want people to please put your questions in the chat box, because we're going to open it up and have Dr. Perry respond to your questions.
Sure. Okay. I mean, so the what do we do, right, is complicated, but I know this. We have to find some new ways of responding. And by that, I mean, we have seen a revitalization of protest, but our traditions of protest they don't function as the kind of leverage they once did, right? So if you take, for example, Montgomery in the context of the boycott, The majority of the people who rode the bus were Black. It was a local service, right? Boycotts now are much harder when you're talking about multinational corporations and we're just a tiny portion of the population, right? The leverage of protest in the streets, right, doesn't have the same function because, to be honest, people are, the American public is no longer surprised at seeing Black people beaten or killed, right? In fact, I think the American public is desensitized to it. They have learned all these narratives to explain it away, right? And so we have to think about the politics of how to exercise leverage really, really seriously, right? How do you put a wrench in the works, right? So we have to have inspiration for the past in terms of thinking about that question, but we can't use the same tactics. And in the meantime, we also have to think a lot about, as my mother always is saying, self-activity. What are we doing internal?
What are you doing? Yes.
Right? How do we ensure not just, saying, well, these institutions are unfair? How do we create educational opportunities for our kids internal to our communities, right? How do we exercise mutual aid, given how economically unjust the society is, so that we're not going hungry? That we have to think about that, because whatever transformations I hope will happen, it's going to take a long time, right? And we do have to hunker down and care for ourselves. And I actually think really the associations, I mean, that's part of what was behind May We Forever Stand, because it's a model, right? That
Yes.
even in the most devastating time, right, there's lynching, Jim Crow, Black people were figuring out, how do we work together to build vibrant institutions? How do we assist each other, support each other, aid each other? And I think, we really do have to return to that.
Yeah. And while we're doing that, that's one arm of it.
Yeah.
And if you look on the New York Times bestsellers list, and you look at the kinds of books about race that are being written, they're really books that are really educating others. They're not written for the Black audience. They're educating others about how to look at race.
Right.
I think we do see something in young people. If you look at Black Lives Matter, there are so many of the youth, young people, young white people who are in the movement. So you have one arm where you look at, we have to look within and look at how we strengthen our communities. And you talk about the formalism that we have to build on within the Black community and our organizations and our churches. But the other arms, I would say there has to be some other things that are going on simultaneously that involve other people.
I think that's right. And in that process, they have to understand that this is not, it's a lifelong struggle, right? So to be committed to building a society that is not racist, that is not classist, that is not as organized around bigotry, that's not something that you do for a little while and expect to achieve the end. It is actually a disposition towards what your life's purpose is. And I do, so that I think is another piece to it, right? So as we educate, the world and become educated ourselves, we have to think this is ongoing work. This isn't like I read these 5 books and now I am reformed, right?
No, and now more than ever, if you're looking at what we are going through in this country, if you're not motivated now, then something is wrong. We're going to open this up. We have questions from the audience. Okay, I'm looking on the chat here. Okay. And so I'm just going to continue because I'm not seeing this unless I'm not seeing this on the chat. Going back to you talked about Black Lives Matter. What message do you have for hip hop artists? I'm going to go back to that, who are acting sometimes as leaders of this movement around social justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always what I would like to do is to think about how we invite a conversation, across, so that if anyone who has a large platform, right, is invested in these issues, they have to see themselves as listeners, um, uh, more than speakers, in the sense that it is always essential to connect with people on the ground, not just organizers, but people who are experiencing the brunt of the brutality, the brunt of the inequality, to listen, to sort of to be, and of course read also to understand the forces, but actually to be attentive. And one of the things that I've written about and talked about is why it's important for me to, why I don't live in Princeton, is because I need to be able to walk where I can see the Walmart, and I can see the cash checking place, and I can see, because
Right.
I need, in order to do the work that I do, I have to be able to actually feel some proximity,
Right.
right, to,
In and of the community.
yeah. And I live in a suburb, but a suburb that's very, very close. Walking
Well,
distance.
it says, our suburbs have become more integrated too. But
Yes. And so I think, because I want to know what I'm talking about on a visceral level, as
yes,
well as on an kind of knowledge level, the way we tend to think of it. Yeah.
right. Okay, we have a question from Jimmy. It's actually for both of us, and we're going to ask you to lead. Why
Yeah.
do you think hip hop is reduced to rap music and scholarship when emceeing is just one element of hip hop?
I think that it's primarily because those of us who first got interested in it were literary scholars, because of the writing and because of extraordinary writing. So I think, it's expanded though. There are people who, scholars of dance, scholars of art, who are visual art. I think the sort of, and also scholars of music, right, who are in digital technology. So there's some good work. Lyndon Barrett, Alex Whaley, people who are actually talking about the sonic composition. But I think the answer is really based on who among scholars was first interested in writing about hip hop, had to do with, with people who were focused on the literary.
I
Yeah.
agree. And then again, those who are doing the scholarships in the academy, there's a certain level of their research has to conform in a certain way,
Right.
so that what they may want to write is not what's going to be accepted as
Yeah.
valid or
Yes.
legitimate scholarship in the academy. So you
Yeah.
have to think there's a push and pull. And
Absolutely.
then and you can speak to this in African American studies in general. There's a challenge of really being, how are you validated as a scholar if you're not in a department or in school that supports the whole notion of African American studies as interdisciplinary?
That's right.
And that is still going on. So I think the person who is doing the research in that area has to have people around them and be in that community that's going to support that.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case. And I'll say, for example, my Prophets of the Hood was not in my tenure file. That was not.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I
Okay.
wrote law review articles for tenure. It was not. It was completely set, because it was very clear to me. It was made clear to me by my dean at the time. This was not going to be considered a book that counted, even though it was published by a university press. So yeah, that's a huge piece of it. And
Right.
that also wasn't my dissertation. My dissertation was on late 19th century law and literature, like a completely
Yeah.
different topic for
Yeah.
precisely the reasons.
But
Yeah.
I think that's a message that we have to tell people who are going into these fields, that you do what the academy says you need to do, and then you go do what you want to do.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to be willing to do that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Cecilia Falls asks, Black, and she's talking about Black institution building. What existing institutions need more of our support? What institutions need to be developed?
So I think, I just want to say really quickly, I don't live in a suburb of Princeton. I live right outside of Philly, which is a little,
Right.
someone just made a comment. I think that's a local question. It's hard to, I think the question of institutions really has to, I mean, I think it's wonderful to support the national institutions, but I think the ones that you can commit to over 10 years, 20 years in your neighborhood or in your city, those are the institutions, right? That's where you make the greatest impact. So, um, whether that is, that can be something as simple as book clubs for kids, right? That can be, the organizations attached to your religious institution, or a local school, or a political organization, teachers unions, for example, where there's significant numbers of cities where there's significant numbers of Black teachers. I mean, I think, so I'm sorry, I'm not really answering that question, but
Well, I have to add to it. I cannot let that question go without talking about the Center for Black Literature,
that's it.
talking about how we need more institutions. And we were initially founded to institutionalize the National Black Writers Conference because we didn't have the resources to produce it every year.
Mm.
But we do much more. We do the conference, we do symposia, we do a program for youth, we do research. And part of when I was writing the proposal to found this center, it's part of CUNY, I looked at the other center that is supporting Black literature and Black artists, and it was the Gwendolyn Brooks Center for
Yeah.
Creative Writing and Culture in Chicago, which that was started by Hakeem Mahabudi.
Yes.
So there are so few, and actually there was an organization across the country that looked at centers across the country, centers and institutes and departments around Black studies. And I think, if we're going to ensure that Black studies is sustained, we need to continue to have institutionalized ways of supporting this. This is the 50th anniversary of Black Studies programs in this country. And unfortunately, we see some of them being subsumed under ethnic studies.
Yeah.
And so it'd be very, very easy for that to disappear unless we find ways of supporting it and collaborating with other institutions like the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, Weeksville Restoration, Bed-Stuy Restoration. There are a number of, I'm talking locally.
Yes,
locally,
absolutely. Yes.
But even, in Chicago and looking in Washington, D.C. So I think we have to do it on that level also.
Yeah. And can I say something really quickly, just a little anecdote that speaks to that point? So in my department, African American Studies at Princeton, there are 4 people in our building. We have 14 faculty. There are 4 people in our building, all of whom were from 4 different places. I was born in Alabama. Professor Glaude was from coastal Mississippi. Professor Taylor is from Dallas, and Professor Goldthry is from Missouri. All 4 of us have grandparents who went to Pearl High in Nashville, right? And I mention that because, my grandmother didn't finish Pearl, right? But that it was an institution that instilled something, right? That had a sustaining impact where we all wound up being professors, grandchildren being professors of Black studies, right? And it's
Right.
and I don't mean this in a sort of like, it's not the kind of a bourgeois fancy institution. It was an institution that was invested in the development of Black young people, right? And we can see the evidence of it. So there's sometimes we don't even know what the impact of these places we invest in will be.
What is your thoughts on independent Black schools? There's some people, we have some of the charter schools are really being modeled on independent Black schools. Yeah. That's something that really came of age. My children went to independent Black schools. They started out because I wanted them to have a strong foundation. Yeah. Of who they are, but you don't see as many of them around. Do you think that would help to support some of the issues that we're dealing with? There are people, I'm reading Kamala Harris's book now. She made a conscious decision to want to go to Howard University. Yeah. There's something about wanting to go to a predominantly Black college or, starting out independent schools because of that that nurturing and sense of pride
Yeah.
it gives you and sense of community.
Yeah. I mean, I think Black institutions are incredibly important. We see that they continue to be the institutions that provide the foundation for Black professionals. You know, whether we're talking about physicians or attorney. I mean, they cannot. There are not other institutions that do the same work. I also think historically. So I went to my preschool was a school that was created out of the boycott of Milwaukee public schools. It was called Urban Day as opposed to the Country Day schools. That was in a building that the Catholic Church gave over to the Black community in protest. And my godmother was the head of a similar school in Boston that was an Afrocentric school. So I believe in those institutions. They were instrumental in my life. I think one of the challenges with the sort of intersection of the independent Black school movement and charters is that oftentimes, one, they're not often, I mean, this is not universal, but people who have decided they're going to spend their lives invested in building these institutions. And this is not, building a school, especially for kids in underserved communities, is not something you can do for a couple of years and master. You have to be committed, right? And so the question is like, how do we build real institutions, not this sort of like, I have an idea, I want to build, and then I'm going to go to law school, which is what you see a lot, right? So the difference, for example, between,
but how do we sustain
Chicago,
our institutions? Yes.
So I love Carolyn Hockey's wife, the way she talks about the role of sort of building an educational institution, building community. For me, that's the model. So it's important.
That's been their life's work. Yes. They're a good model to look at.
Yeah.
So, I'm going back to Pedro has a question about jazz. And as I said, music is a theme, a metaphor in all of your work. He's asking, where do you see jazz in today's world? And does it have the same attraction as hip hop? We meet a lot of jazz musicians too in your work.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, it obviously is not as popular. There are some people who have recently had some sort of more crossover success, like Kamasi Washington or Esperanza Spalding. But it is also the case that, jazz doesn't have the same audience as pop music. I think it's important. I mean, I said this even sort of way back when. If we think something is important, we have to patronize it. We have to celebrate it. We have to pay attention to it. And for me, especially in academia, because there's so much relative attention to the very popular artists, I'm sort of focused on. I want to look at artistry that I think is really extraordinary, that is not necessarily super popular, right? I think a lot about how do we curate attention? How do we feed ourselves with work that is beautiful and meaningful? I think we have to be very deliberate. It's easy to passively consume now, like just the stuff that comes at you. And I think we have to be careful about the choices we make, So yes, listen to jazz.
Okay. So we are down to a close. Do you have closing comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I will say I wanted to respond to this point that April Silver made that I think is important about having Black voices from Black institutions. And I want to connect that to both the question about music and some of the questions that we've talked to about relative popularity and which books are most popular and the like. I think that there are engines of how things get attention in this society. There are corporate forces, right, where people pay attention, where you are directed to think, to value, right? And I just, I really, and I know it's sort of a basic thing to say, but we have to take control of those decisions for ourselves. We have to look for things that are meaningful for us. We have to listen more broadly. We can't just passively say, listen, people say these are the these are the smart people you should pay attention to. I think that even coming from an institution that gets a lot of attention, I treat that idea with a great deal of skepticism. I'm looking for the things that are going to be meaningful to me. And I understand that oftentimes the things that are going to be meaningful to me are not going to be where all the funding is, right? And all of the support is. And so I sort of think we have to take that in our own hands and also cultivate conversation. So I want to thank you, because that, is such, the first time I attended the conference, it was one of these really moving experiences, because you don't get to have those kinds of conversations as much as used to exist. And it really, really important. So.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for spending this time with us and for sharing your passion. It's one of the things I've admired. You're very passionate about what you're doing, and it's very clear that you're not going to do anything that you're not totally committed to.
Yeah.
And you've offered a lot to us through your research and scholarship, and I wish you well. I want to thank our audience.
Yes,
thank our
you all
attendees.
so much.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, the comments, the presence. We are going to have this available after the program. It'll be available on a recording. So you'll be receiving an email about that. So it will live. It will live on the internet. And please remember to come to our next programs. Visit the Center for Black Literature, which lists all of our programs. We have the National Black Writers Conference coming up. We're focusing on playwrights and screenwriters, activism, race, and identity. We're honoring Carl Clay, Boza Rivers, Richard Wesley, Stanley Nelson, and Dominique Morisseau. We're going to have panels and roundtables. You can register now. If you go to the Center for Black Literature website, you can register. And we have some other exciting pre-conference programs coming up. Next week, we're doing a program on Black divas and the stage. We're doing a program, we're discussing the film The Hate You Live is coming up. We're doing a town hall debriefing on November 4th after the election. That's going to be, and we have Nicole Hannah-Jones and Gloria Brown-Marshall and Lee. I'm not going to say his name, but it's on the website.
Okay.
So I'm not saying it because I don't want to say it incorrectly. Our opening program is free for the National Black Writers Conference. We'll highlight the keynote speakers for the opening program are Talib Kweli and
Awesome.
Talib Kweli. Come on, help me. Boy, she's gonna be really upset here. Okay. And I remember, you know why I'm remembering
Jessica Caremoore. Jessica Caremoore.
Jessica Caremoore. Thank you.
That's going to be amazing.
Just had a block. That's going to be amazing. Talking about For the Culture. That's going to be curated by April Silver, For the Culture. So it's going to be exciting. And this is the first of many. So thank you for helping to lead our fall programs. Imani Perry.
So much. Take care, everybody.
Okay. Take care.